Hello and welcome to Radio Free Nintendo. I'm James Jones, and I'm joined today by Mr. Greg Leahy.
Ahoy, hoy, everyone.
Mr. John Lindemann.
It's great to be here.
And Mr. Guillaume Vayette.
Hello, hello.
It's September 21st, 2026. And I don't know why my levels are so low, besides the fact I'm talking low. But they seem very low when I talk like that. So that's probably a great introduction. That's definitely not going to sound like garbage. But hey, hello, welcome to Radio Free Nintendo. This is episode 841. And we're going to get into some email to start the show off this week. I don't know why I went with the subtle, calm voice, but it's not picking up on the microphone super well. So we're just going to go with regular action James in action mode. And I'll read the first email. But where can you send emails? Well, that's a great question, John.
RFN at NintendoWorldReport.com.
That's right. That's
James.
RFN. That's right. That's RFN at NintendoWorldReport.com. RFN at NintendoWorldReport.com. And you can send your emails and questions and comments and thoughts and things that might get subpoenaed or accidentally released in a lawsuit because our lawyers are bad, like these people did. Daniel writes, "Good day, RFN Pty Limited. So unlike a lot of Nintendo fans my age, the old AF over 40s, I started my Nintendo love through their handheld output. I'd never had an NES. My first Nintendo anything was a Nelsonic Super Mario Watch and then an old brick Game Boy. So I've always been more about the handheld output for my nostalgia of Nintendo. I'd long waited for Game Boy games to come to NSO, and when it was announced, I was excited to hopefully see some light shone on the great libraries of the Game Boy Color, and the GBA. However, here we are, over 6 months later, and the libraries have hardly been touched. In the time since it was announced that we were getting these libraries on NSO, we've only seen 18 titles come to the Game Boy/Color lineup, which is less than the NES lineup launched with. We are still missing games like Super Mario Land 1, Donkey Kong 94, Revenge of the Gator, Mole Mania, Mario Golf, and Tennis. GBA is even more dire with only 12 titles. I've kind of noticed over the years that the handheld side of Nintendo's legacy, despite being its financial backbone for years, often gets ignored and not given the same amount of attention as stuff from their console lineage or lineups. Is it just because pretty 8-bit and 16-bit sprites are easier thing to market than 4 shades of gray? Or something else, like that by the time they got to handheld stuff, the luster of digital services is kind of wearing off? Why do we see stuff like Quest for Sodding Camelot before any Mario Portable sports games? Anyway, sorry for the long one, guys. Keep up the great work, and thanks for everything."
Maybe it's because Game Boy Color is garbage. How's about that? Let's start there.
Hold on.
The thing about Game Boy Color is it's very short-lived. I mean, there's
very short-lived.
There's not that much time, for it to, kind of, and it was a strange kind of bridge system, really, that you kind of feel like wouldn't have existed were it not for the very peculiar set of circumstances where Pokemon completely revitalizes the Game Boy platform to such a level where they kind of wanted to make new hardware that would help kind of cash in on the surge in interest and popularity in its sort of portable line. But at the same time, they didn't want to do a generational leap that kind of cut things off either. So all of a sudden, this kind of enhanced, system became. It had some exclusive games. It had some games that worked with both, and obviously it played all the old games. That was the kind of preferable approach at that point to go to a bridge.
Right.
But of course, by definition, such a thing was never going to be around that long, and it wasn't. And also, it's worth mentioning, I suppose, that a decent amount of significant releases for Nintendo, or some of their kind of more long-term, like third-party kind of partners were like NES games and NES derivatives, which, get in retrospect, don't hold that much value on like a subscription service. Not that this has stopped Nintendo from like having a bunch of different versions of things on sort of a virtual console.
We've joked about it with what game was it that we realized is on 3 or 4 different times? On NSO?
There's more than a few, and certainly on virtual consoles before that, there's been, plenty of things that have had duplicate kind of releases. Certainly, like I think the virtual console had many different versions of Street Fighter 2. You could have the TG16 version. You could have, like maybe at least one Genesis version, multiple Super Nintendo, with the Turbo and Super. So, they haven't sort of shied away from that altogether, but you know what I mean. It's not a shock that it's like, do we need to rush to put Super Mario Brothers Deluxe on there? Which I think didn't they give that away on Virtual Console for 3DS at one point? So. Like again, they can't even then
give it away in what context?
I can't remember. It might have been something to do with like Club Nintendo or My Nintendo or whatever it was at that juncture.
Mm-hmm. I don't think so, because I don't own it. I feel like I would own it otherwise.
Yeah, it may have been this may have been a European initiative, because I certainly have it without paying for it. I recall that quite distinctly. But the point is, some of those natural choices for GBC. I mean, for a start, like I said, I think I mentioned this last week. Like, it seems like at least in the updates, have been more skewed to GBC than to the regular Game Boy, actually. Because now the GBC games outnumber them. But like I said, you've got some of these games that don't necessarily make the most natural choices, because they might have, kind of versions that a lot of people would consider preferable already on, NSO, in the case of those NES games. Then you have the Pokemon situation where it's like, the core Pokemon games are, these really big deals, but they didn't show up on Virtual Console for a very long time. When they did, I mean, you have to hand it to them. They actually had functionality that other Virtual Console games did not. They had the link cable stuff. So,
they were also at a premium price.
Yes, they were. So, again, it's not a surprise in that sense that we didn't just come out of the gate with like, oh, here's gold and silver, just right there from day one. Like the previous experience has perhaps conditioned us to not expect something like that.
Well, and the other thing about the shift to them making the color is it was good for licensed games, because previously licensed games wouldn't have been as interested in making a grayscale game, especially as it's like 99. Whereas if they could make it in color, you might be able to get more like cartoons and stuff to put their games out. And that also speaks to part of the reason why the Game Boy lineup is so weird, is that there is a lot of licensed stuff on it relative to its overall weight.
Yeah, even GBA, still with GBA. I know with GBA, obviously, it kind of feels like, the great power of it and everything enabled, like, Nintendo and some of the third-party publishers to put more kind of console-style experiences on it, maybe. But still a good chunk of that library was licensed stuff. And again, licensed stuff is not a quest for sodding Camelot accepted. it is generally not as likely to show up on services like this.
Well, and go ahead, Gil.
No, well, I just want to say, like, I don't know, like, yes, a lot of games were licensed. Maybe a lot of them weren't great, but one of the good news is that even though Nintendo is ignoring these, the Game Boy overall, not all companies are, and like, it looks like some companies have remembered that they have made Game Boy games over the years, and sometimes they even remember to put them in collections. So that's one thing that I think that is good on the Switch. That's better than it was on 3DS. Well, and like now, with more and more, like, there are these companies coming up with these collections, and they put in the work. They include the Game Boy games, and games that I never thought
Bill
I
and
would.
Ted.
Well, yeah. So sometimes you get a Bill and Ted Excellent Retro Collection, which is like, why? But like we get it, like it exists. So it has the merit of existing. If you were looking for it, now you can purchase that.
Get help if you were looking for it.
But personally, like I also grew up with the Game Boy. I didn't have the Nintendo. I had the Super Nintendo very late. Like the Donkey Kong Country was already out by the time I got one. So yeah, so I think that ultimately the truth is that a lot of Game Boy games haven't really held up. And so, yes, I do believe that they're just, a tougher sell for most people. Like, even people who grew up with them don't necessarily want to go back to them.
How is that different than the NES, though? Most of the NES games haven't held up.
I think it's a little bit different, like, because the games were very, very slight. Like, when I talked about the Kawabunga collection, I went back to a game that I owned back in the day, Fall of the Foot Clan, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it was simpler than I remembered. First of all, I remembered it in its entirety because I played it that much, but also because it's that short and that simple. But also, like, I realized, like, wait a minute, like this was basically on the simplicity level of like a Tiger Electronics machine. Like the enemies just jumped at you from the bottom, from the left, from the right. You just pressed the button to kill them instantly and kept moving forward. So that represents a lot of games, at least a lot of the early games on the Game Boy. So yeah, I do think that most people are just going to look at that, maybe play them for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then move on. Even Super Mario. Even something like Super Mario Land, which has the Mario Cache, you can complete that game in less than 30 minutes.
Oh, you could. I did at school because I didn't have a Game Boy growing up, but other people on Toy Day at the end of term had a Game Boy and I'm like, I'll play that. I finished it.
Yep.
I didn't. At that point, my primary Mario experience was Super Mario World, in Japanese, which meant it was like, uncovering some, kind of archaeological site, in complexity for a 6-7-year-old at that time. Right. To go from that to Super Mario Land, I enjoyed it, but it felt very slight, to say the least. But that's the thing, it actually makes them more suitable for a subscription model, in my opinion.
Yeah, I know.
But the irony of that...
Maybe not such a good selling argument, right? And like maybe not that much of an incentive for Nintendo to go get like third parties games on there.
Yeah, I think that's the real issue, is that and in terms of, I think what was alluded to in the question about like the luster coming off these sorts of services or something, because it is, Switch Online is 5 years old now. Even though they drag their feet so long, it can feel like it's more recent. But it's 5 years old. But whereas, of course, Game Boy games have only been there, relatively recently. And in what has happened in those 5 years, well, it does seem like, as Guillaume already kind of touched on, with, really improbable things coming, back, like the licensed things, like Bill and Ted. You've got Game Boy stuff in the Jurassic Park collection that's coming up from Limited Run Games and stuff.
So I've got a list, and like some of the stuff is really good, and some stuff that I had lost hope, to one day see on a Nintendo system again. But like Collection of Mana has Final Fantasy Adventure. I know that James disagrees, but I think it's aged very well. It was one of the better games I had in the early 90s, and I still really enjoy it. It's very janky.
Disagree that it's aged well.
Well, I still really enjoyed it. I played through it, which is more than I can say for a lot of Game Boy games.
I would say somebody who doesn't have an emotional connection to that
game.
No, but it's about 70% jank by volume.
Yeah, but what's the Secret of Mana is janky as well.
That's not in the same way.
Yeah,
not to the same degree.
Yeah, no, I know. Like back in the 90s, like I remember one day I was playing through the game and all of a sudden I warped through like several screens, like to a future part of the game that I just could not keep up with. Like I was under leveled for where I was because some bug had me warped to a different part of the map, and the enemies were too hard.
Guillaume's a speedrunner and doesn't realize it.
Yeah. I can't really reproduce it, but
there's a jank difference though of like text boxes just not telling you what they need to tell you.
But I've had
game.
some people. I've had I think that someone who can appreciate the Game Boy for what it is would get a kick out of Final Fantasy Adventure. Like, and I've had some people tell me. I've had at least one person tell me like, yes, I've played Final Fantasy Adventure for the first time on this collection, and I really liked it. So. There are different opinions out there. But anyway, it's not the only game out there. Like, Collection of Saga is like Final Fantasy Legend 1 through 3. Again, I own 2 and 3, so now I can rediscover the first one. And 2 and 3, I think, hold up. Like, if you've got fondness for them, and if you've never played them, and you want to play some of the better Game Boy games that were available, those are it. Like, it would be hard to find a better Game Boy RPG before Pokemon. Anyway, but then like you've got Contra Anniversary Collection, which has Operation C on there, which is a really good version. It's like the first thing I fired up when I played that collection. The Game Boy sound is really good for the Contra theme, apparently. The Castlevania Anniversary Collection is also very good. It's got the Castlevania The Adventure, which is and Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, which was better,
Definitely
and which we never got on the virtual console. And the
Inexplicable, that, isn't it? What was going on with that? Why put The Adventure on there and not Belmont's Revenge? Just skip to the good one. But it may have been sales, is the truth of it. Because Castlevania might have sold really quite well because it was, it was a sort of name that Nintendo fans would have known, and quite a few probably had some fond feelings for. So that then, if they get a Game Boy, and they're not like properly armed with reviews or whatever, it's just I'll get the Game Boy Castlevania, sure. And there's no way for their feedback, which presumably would have been less complimentary, to kind of get back if you're just kind of looking at sales.
Yeah. Well, the Kowabunga collection has all 3 TMNT games, and that's amazing. Even though I don't like the first one, but it's got very good sprites. Very good sprites. The turtles are very cute. And then the second, the sequel, Back from the Sewers, they shed the bed with the sprites. I don't love it. And then the third one is a Metroidvania, Radical Rescue, which I did not stick with when I played the collection, but your mileage may vary. I wish they had added a working map for that game. And then like you've got stuff like like in the Disney Classic Games collection, you've got the Game Boy versions also of some of those games, right? Like Jungle Book.
I think they might have added them later, or because they've worked to get more stuff into those games, right? Like there was a whole other game that got added at one point, right? What was it? I forget what it was now. Was it like Jungle Book?
I think it was Jungle Book, yeah. Originally it was Aladdin and
Lion King. Yeah. So,
right.
Some of these sort of efforts, to keep adding stuff, and again, some of it's just the practicality of working through licensing and, kind of these hoops you got to jump through. It's, it can be kind of difficult stuff, but the point is now, I think much more so than in 2018, it seems like people are out there, some of these boutique publishers or maybe just the rights holders are more willing to like, avoid just saying, it's small beer, forget it. Like, there's enough interest out there, obviously from consumers as well, that these games are less likely to get licensed to an NSO type service, are more likely to be bundled up into these various collections of particular series and so forth. So that gives you less room to run with NSO. Now, you might be thinking, well, what has this got to do with Mole Mania and, DK94 and all that? Well, first of all, we talked about a reason why DK94 might have been put on the back burner last week, which is they've got this game that's very much like DK94 that's going to be coming out as a new release with the Mario vs. DK remake. But more than that, I suppose we've also got to look at the fact that if there's going to be less from the outside, because you're not going to be able to have Contra, you're not going to be able to have Castlevania, etc., etc., then they may see value in spreading out their own stuff more slowly, a slower drip feed than even what we saw on the NES and the Super Nintendo libraries, because it just in those 5 years, things have changed somewhat, and it may be more difficult to fill out that stuff with the third party games than it was then. So, obviously a lot of that is speculative. I can't say with any authority exactly what's going on there, but I think that's a big part of, it just seems like, it's very much the same with GBA as well. Just kind of like, we're gonna, we want there to be a stream of new stuff. We don't want to just say, let's put out everything in a big block and say, have at it. We need to create this feeling of things are being continuously updated to keep people, on a recurring subscription. But if we've got less stuff to do it with, well, that means we're just going to have to do it more slowly. And that's how they're going. Which, but I say, when you consider they already waited this incredibly long to do it in the first place, to do portable games. I mean, how many times did we say in those years, like, where is it? What's going on? It was crazy, really, because again, it is such a big part of their history. Portable games is such a big part of their present. You know what I mean? Like their absolute dominance in Japan is predicated on portability being central to their business, and they are obviously, very sensitive to Japan as their home market. So however much you could talk about some of these sort of mitigating factors or things, it is still kind of just at a certain point, just plain puzzling that, they've dragged their feet this much and kind of seem to give it less reverence than other aspects of their history.
So I do want to kind of weave back into a conversation we were having earlier. I just couldn't get in, which is all the collections that Guillaume you talked about are part of the reason why these aren't in there, but they're none of the examples that Daniel mentioned. All games that Daniel mentioned are Nintendo games. So Nintendo's not doing that. Nintendo could put Mole Mania out fucking tomorrow if they wanted to. Donkey Kong 94 should have been a launch game for this platform because we talked about it last week. It's one of the best original Game Boy games there is. And Nintendo said, none. Not interested.
Maybe they just haven't gotten the Super Game Boy emulation just right yet.
It'd be nice to think that there'd be, like extra features for some of these things, like one game, because they've been. We talked about mainline Pokemon being something that, you could kind of understand why that wouldn't necessarily, if it comes at all, it wouldn't necessarily be too quick with it. But the spin-offs, like, they are a mainstay of the other, like N64, a lot of that is Pokemon spin-offs, right? So where's Pokemon Pinball? That would be great, but hopefully, look, they've got something left field like Tilt and Tumble with Kirby. I talked about that, sure. So I'm not writing it off. But again, it comes down to if you've got, as I already mentioned, if you've got less of the other stuff to pad it out, you have to space out your own stuff more. That's
maybe like they're just thinking like, well, the Switch is like we still don't have an idea of how to sell people an online gameplay, or we don't know how to make our games online enabled. Like Mario, we still can't have people simultaneously play it. Anyway, online, so maybe like all this stuff is going to be stretched over like the Switch 2's life as well.
Well, so it's about being able to continually have things to talk about, and so if the only guarantees you have access to are your own things, like nothing else is guaranteed unless you've got a contract signed. Yeah, you've just gotta kind of milk it, and that means not giving everything people would want on the first go, because if you've got a press, and we talked about this, I can't remember what was in that collection, but there was a collection they dropped a few months ago where we were dumbfounded at just the sheer just nothingness that they had put up. It was like 3 games that were like, who asked for any of these? What the shit?
Yeah. Well, maybe like you got to give Quest for Camelot room to breathe, and you've got to give people time to go through all the stages of grieving before they finally actually start playing it, and then like maybe they give us something else after.
I know you're trying to be funny here, but like there is a math problem that they're trying to solve, which is Nintendo actually didn't make a ton of Game Boy games. Because it was largely left.
No, and we
third
talked
parties
about this,
had it covered.
The N64 was really this sort of transformative experience where it's like, oh shit, like we've really got to fill out this release schedule.
Right.
Well, using Rare and, other like partnerships
Left
and stuff.
Field and
because,
whatever.
like some of the people that were in the Dream Team and, all this, because like, they didn't publish that many games on Super Nintendo. They're almost all on NSO.
Right.
Because there weren't that many of them. Like, there's some stuff that was hardware specific that isn't on there, like Mario Paint and Yoshi Safari, the Super Scope 6 or whatever. But, like, that, it's pretty much all there. And again, one of the things that isn't there, Super Mario RPG. I wonder why that didn't happen. So, like, but again, it's... The N64 experience, though, and then going forward into GameCube and all that, it radically expanded how many games Nintendo started to publish, because they realised that they were going to have to provide some sort of like minimum level of kind of cadence, a sort of steady cadence of releases, to try and preserve interest in systems. If God forbid, from their point of view, they didn't get off to some roaring start and have, third parties just queuing up to make things for it. That wasn't a given anymore, but for Game Boy, much more was the case, that this was, during really the peak of Nintendo's powers that Game Boy came out, riding that huge wave of, the NES being so popular.
And being the only player, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Having, the American market, mostly to itself, in the sort of mid to late 80s. Obviously, the Japanese market, it was completely dominant there as well. So, they were riding high. And obviously, they had a number of games early on for the Game Boy to launch the system, and, a smattering of ones after that. But it wasn't the case that it's like, oh good God, we've got to churn out this, that, and the other, otherwise, people will have nothing to play, because it was clear, right. Kind of to a lot of the same partners that had made games and succeeded on NES that they could do something similar on Game Boy. And obviously there were differences with the markets, but broadly that was true. And then it had this bizarre second life once Pokemon just completely revitalized everything, and that so it's a unique system in terms of its experience, and some of those things factor in, but there's no doubt it's different. It's different than, as was also mentioned in the email, NES. Yeah, a lot of them was the black box stuff and all that launch type of stuff, but they just put that all up there, kind of not
right.
all up
there. And most of it's bad. That's the other thing.
No, it is, but it was like, here's a big batch to get you started. Here's a big batch of games, and it's just like they didn't do that with Game Boy. They kind of split it between a few early games, a few GBC games, one or two in the middle with like Kirby's Dream Land 2 or whatever. But, it was much more of a selection rather than a big batch. And that straight away was probably indicative of like they knew this was going to be a slower parcel out kind of job.
Well, and it would have been more important to establish, because it was coming from absolute zero at that point. There were no other systems on the service yet. So this was about the service having anything in it. Game Boy is additive, so there's already a big log of games. Now, most of them aren't worth playing, or aren't worth playing for more than, 20 minutes, but they're there, whereas, with Game Boy, there was nothing. So
I did think of the example...
NES, rather.
The example I was trying to think of a Game Boy game they have put on there that's kind of duplicative is Blaster Master Enemy Below.
Oh,
because
yeah.
like the NES game is there. In the case of NSO as well, they are somewhat different. Like, it isn't just a kind of like, smaller play area version of the game, I don't believe, but it's still, it's pretty close. So yeah, it does show they are, while that may play a role in some games, like some of the GBC stuff, maybe not showing up that quickly. It's not like they're ruling stuff out on that basis, because we've already got one such example. So I did think we should point that out. I would like to see at least one of the Game Boy Bionic Commandos show up, because that's one of those cases where we're never getting the NES version because of, the Nazi stuff. So, why the Game Boy games were already kind of devoid of that. So whether it's the black and white one that I had on Virtual Console that's quite good, or the NST Game Boy Color one, which I've not played, but that was on Virtual Console 2, right. That they should show up at some point, because Bionic Commando is like a real 8-bit classic. But, somewhat understandably, like, you just don't get to play the original version of it. But, at least you've got some kind of versions out there, in circulation would be nice to have.
Yeah, it would be nice if Nintendo stepped on the gas a little bit, because I just just on the black and white Game Boy, they published over. I'm on the Wikipedia right now. They published over 56. They could release once a month. Yeah, I know. Not all of them. A lot of them are licensed. A lot of them are not by them. Some of them have James Bond in it. But even removing that, release one a month for 4 years. That would be a better rate than what we got now, and that's not counting Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance.
Yeah, that's
so fair. And also, you see, they gave us right away Gargoyle's Quest, which good news, that's one of the better early Game Boy games, but that means that Capcom can be cajoled, enticed to publish something on there.
That means Capcom was willing to give them Gargoyle's Quest.
Well, and they'd already done it with Demon's Crest on the Super Nintendo, so I mean, it's not a huge shock. What's surprising in that is where's Gargoyle's Quest 2 for NES? I mean, that
that's going in a yet to be announced collection.
I would love a Makai collection, just like spin-offs, the main games, as much as you could put together. I'm still not convinced. I know that they did do the new game relatively recently, which was nice. So they have some interest in it. I'm still kind of wait and see on, especially like spin-off stuff being put in a collection. But if you were willing to license those two, I'm surprised the other one hasn't emerged. There is actually a Game Boy version of Gargoyle's Quest 2, but it's exclusive to Japan. I own it, and it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's just the reduced visible play area version of that game, which was not designed for it like the first one. So it does suffer a bit, but again, one of those things that maybe if it was just like on the Japanese version of it for a while, and then maybe it could just show up like Joy Mech Fight and Kirby Star Stacker just did recently one day in some further off update where it's like, oh, actually we need a few things to make up the numbers. We could just make these available.
Yeah. But anyway, the point I was getting at is that Capcom can be, convinced
for some things.
But they're definitely holding some stuff back. And
look at all the Mega Man collections they've done, and then look at the fact that there's a whole bunch of Game Boy Mega Man games. Now, are we going to see that as a standalone collection to go along with, the classic NES collection, the X collections, the ZX Zero collection, or what have we got now?
Battle Network.
Battle Network collection. Yeah, I mean, they've done so many kind of sub-series. It would be a shock if they didn't do the Game Boy games, but, they were on Virtual Console.
It wouldn't be the first time that they failed to put out a collection of the Game Boy Mega Man games. As we may recall, they were supposed to release the Game Boy Mega Man collection on, was it GBA?
Yes.
It was a long time ago, and then that never came out.
Yeah, it fell through.
But they couldn't find a way to reverse the jump and the shoot button, I guess.
I I would expect that they may not have decided to do that collection, but they've definitely been talking about it enough that they haven't decided not to either.
Yeah, they wouldn't
It's
have
like-
greenlit to license it, away to NSO yet. Even maybe
Right.
they don't end up doing it, but just the fact that they're not quite.
They want to
willing.
reserve the ability to do it.
Yeah, I could imagine that. Certainly.
Yeah, and there's like the whole fact that like we just don't know why they make the decisions that they make.
Oh, no,
like any of
no.
these companies.
They probably don't know either. It's sometimes
Right,
it's just
yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah,
Why
I often wonder,
was-
like, is it money related? Is it licensing deals? Do they owe a favor to somebody? It's
Horse
really weird.
trading, maybe. I don't
Why-
know. Maybe there's some
Yeah.
other
Oh, yeah.
deal that gets
Why
done,
was-
and it's part of it. It's a make weight. It's the conditional 7th round pick 2 years from now that somehow squares
exactly.
a deal somewhere.
You have to take
why
Quest
was-
for Camelot. God damn it.
Yeah, why was Kirby's Dream Land 2 held back on the North American eShop for years? For years. Like, where's that Iwata asks,
Because
I
Hal was playing fucking Hardball, Guillaume. That's why.
I guess.
And finally, Nintendo's like, we'll throw you out of the fucking office. Just it's going on the service one way or the other. Do you want to be homeless, Hal? Oh, fine. Put it on the eShop. It really probably is a lot of just like horse trading and a certain amount of like, well, we released a game kind of like that last time, so let's not do that one this time.
And
Let's
then,
do this
like I
other
said,
one.
there's the forward there's the forward element to it as well in terms of Nintendo's own stuff. We don't know which games are getting remade, or this, that, and the other, or maybe a game that's sort of similar to it, and how that influences decision making. So.
Hey, we could release this game to promo this other thing we have coming.
Yeah,
let's sit on it
exactly.
for a
It's like,
while.
yeah, exactly. No, it's not like it. In the case of like Super Mario RPG or the DK94, like it might mean you don't do it for quite a while. In other cases, you might like to actually use it as like a cross promotional kind of thing. Like this game's coming out. Well, rediscover. I mean, certainly they did that in. The very earliest days of their, experience with this. You think back to like Metroid Prime 3 coming out. That's what they did. They's like, oh yeah, and now we're putting, Super Metroid on the Virtual Console. We're kind of building up to the release of it that way. But that's certainly something they used to do, do from like the earliest days of this kind of stuff. So yeah, you've got things like that to consider. I think the point I would make about it all, like I said, because in the end we don't know, you can only speculate, but I would separate, the way they've handled it since it started is probably just managing this stream of stuff, right? It's just like we've got so much stuff, we want to spread it out over this length of time. We've got these other considerations about things we want to hold back or things we want to use to promote stuff, and then you just kind of putting it in slots, right? And that's how they're doing it. It's probably pretty mundane, really. What the decision making process. I don't think that is reflective of like a lack of reverence or proper respect for their portable heritage. I think not doing it for the better part of 5 years, that's the bit that's more kind of like, okay, do you care about this part of it? That's the part of it that's not how it's been managed since it started, just that whole way that it was ignored for so long.
It either reflects that or it reflects what Nintendo thinks their fans think. And there's a little bit of
I imagine that's a big part of it, yeah. But it's still surprising when you consider, the Japanese element, the home market part of it. I think it makes it surprising.
I do wonder how much nostalgia. I mean, Pokemon, obviously, but like, how many nostalgic games are there for the handhelds, especially for the old Game Boy in Japan? It's a weird thing. Like, Tetris was the game for that system until Pokemon happened, and Tetris is basically a launch game for it. So, like, what's I'm not saying it's the only game, but I'm saying like the game that's associated with that system. So it's a little bit weird.
Probably some version of Mahjong.
Yeah, exactly. And like, guess what? I'm going to play Mahjong on my phone.
That's Tetris and that are both. They did make sure to get those on there day one.
Get your Mahjong. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. Japan loves their fucking Mahjong games. But But yeah, I mean, it's Greg, to what you're speaking about. I mean, I do deal with this on a much more mundane and smaller level, but 90% of my job is just directing the trains through. I've got 25 items that need to get prioritized and sorted, and it's just making sure they don't slam into each other in hilariously stupid ways.
Yeah, I'm sure part of it too is the licensees or the game publishers, I guess, like Capcom, for instance. They probably have their top 10 games like, okay, for services like this, we just give them this as a matter of course to shut them up, and then anything else, they'll have to talk to us about it.
Or maybe Capcom's like, yeah, you can have that game, but don't release it at the same time as you release, these categorizations of games. Like I'm sure there is a certain amount of like, all right, what do you need? And they're like, we don't want to see this game released.
Well, we know, from a sort of
Konami bullshit,
a weird source that like Nintendo kind of solicits these sorts of kind of games, sometimes particular things in mind, because the whole story of the Live Alive remake, right? Like the idea was that Nintendo went to Square saying, can we have Live Alive for this service? Basically, it wasn't like, we've got. What games will you give us? Like, seemingly it was Nintendo that kind of went there with the idea of, like, could you give us Live Alive? Thinking that was one of the ones that they would accept, perhaps, because of there's probably so many that they knew were simply impossible, like Final Fantasy 3/6 or whatever, for instance. But then, in fact, in doing that, did not get it on NSO. They got it remade as a HD 2D thing.
Negotiations got way out of control very fast.
That's not so much horse trading as like, sort of making a mountain out of a molehill type of scenario.
Did it not come out in in Japan on the service?
I've not seen it on there.
No, I don't know. It didn't. Like,
it was on Virtual Console but back on the the new 3DS would have had it in Japan, certainly. But and also for that matter, those Final Fantasy games were actually on new 3DS. But again, to another one of the emails points, like things have changed a bit, I think, since those days. And obviously that was a different model where you actually pay, per game, but also just this far greater kind of recognition, and kind of rights holders of like our stuff is worth things, is worth something to people, and we can bundle it and distribute it ourselves as we see fit, rather than being at the whims of Nintendo's model. So that's how we're going to do it.
And that's definitely happened in other media where originally companies like Netflix, when they first got into streaming, could just go around and get the rights to, stuff for a song. And now it's like, no, if you want Friends, that's $150 million a year. It's like, whoa, what? Why?
Yeah, no one had any idea when the business model was completely new.
Right. And as people have realized, these have value now.
That's just why every network has a streaming service now.
Yeah, exactly. These aren't just relics. These aren't things that people will watch when they're very bored. They will consume the entirety of their focus. Now, that hasn't happened with virtual games, obviously, or virtual console games, obviously. But still, there is recognition, I guess is the best way of putting it. But we spent a lot of time on this email. I
just want to say that while we were having this conversation, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror was announced for NSO expansion pack.
Sure.
And I just want to mention a few honorable mentions for this category. So, I don't know if we've named all the collections that had Game Boy games. I know that soon you'll be able to play A Boy and His Blob retro collection, and finally, play The Rescue of Princess Blobette, the Game Boy version. But the honorable mentions would be like Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection, Volume 1 and 2. That's pretty cool to get the Neo Geo Pocket games on there, and they're good collections, even though they're mostly, fighting games.
Yep.
The Mega Man Zero ZX Legacy Collection, that's GBA, but still it's very cool. Castlevania Advance Collection, Mega Man Battle Network Collection, Aleste Collection has Game Gear games.
Game Gear games, yeah.
So that's another thing.
It's pretty out there. But also the interesting thing about that collection is it has an original game. They made a new Game Gear Aleste game. to go with
Right,
it.
yeah.
It's not just the old ones. They have, I think, like, maybe it's just, I think there's two of them, but then also maybe their Master System versions, because those were very closely related, obviously, other than the screen resolution. They were essentially the same. But then M2 made a new game, and apparently it's really good. Like, every impression that I've read of that collection suggests that the GG Alesta 3 is like amazing for an 8-bit shooter, but it's something that could definitely run on a Game Gear. Like, they didn't cheat. And so that's amazing to me. It's such a odd thing.
And also honorable mentions, you've got fake Game Boy games. So the Pixel Game Maker series, I think that's some sort of like retro game maker thing that people can make games with on PC. You know, like you buy a little bit like RPG. What's it called? The RPG Maker. Anyway, so most of the games I think in that series are, you know, kind of pseudo NES games, but you've got a few Game Boy games on there, including some sort of Double Dragon like for Game Boy. And then one dishonorable mention would be the Darius Cosmic Collection, which had the Game Boy game that was only available as a pre-order if you pre-ordered the Japan version.
Yeah, the physical version in Japan had a pre-order bonus. It might have even been like retailer exclusive or something, like if you had to pre-order it from Amazon, or I forget, but yeah, it was quite narrow.
Yeah, so very, very shitty.
But they did release it later on the Japanese eShop as a standalone download. It was much later, like years later, but they did it, and I have it from my Japanese account.
Cool. I'm done.
Okay. I'm very ready to move on to the next email. All right, John, would you read it?
Certainly. Jefferson writes, "Hi RFN. Reading reactions to Starfield, I've seen multiple people claim that Bethesda's design sensibilities are stuck in 2008. This made me think about how this is a criticism that's pretty unique to video games. With movies and music, you can criticize something for looking or sounding dated, but if you say something feels like an early 70s movie or sounds like an 80s pop song, that could just as easily be a compliment. It also made me wonder if design sensibilities have changed that much since 2008. At least for single-player games, it doesn't feel like any of the technological advances in the last 15 years have opened the door for new types of games. I'd argue that some of the few developments that have happened in the time frame, like skill trees or procedural generation, sometimes make games worse. Anyways, my question is, in your mind, is there a year or game that acts as a cutoff between outdated versus modern game design? For me, I notice that I tend to think of 2004 to 2006 as a dividing line. You have a lot of games published in that time frame that set the blueprint for modern games. GTA San Andreas, Oblivion, Resident Evil 4, etc. Keep up the marginally better than adequate work."
Motherfucker.
The move to HD, I think is the real demarcation point there that he's talking about. Move to HD across the board.
I think there are multiple ones, and sometimes when I go back to older games, I kind of rediscover, like, oh yeah, that's how games were back then. You know, like I mentioned it last week when with that weird Tomb Raider collection, but like I'm glad that they're going back to the old Tomb Raider games and not changing, like not the Legend version, which was a remake of the first game. Because the remake itself is now very dated, and very very much remade the game to with its era's sensibilities, early 2000s, and so like you've got QTEs, like the boss fights are basically, instead of just shooting at the T-Rex, you kind of try to lure it into spike traps and stuff like that. And it's like it's a different game, but it's still a dated game. But yeah, I don't know. Like also, like recently-ish, I talked about Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. I reviewed the second game, and I just could not believe, like, it was shocking to see a game so close, you know, in time, kind of, to the HD era and like the Uncharted era, but like right before that. And so like you can see, I think that Uncharted 2 is probably one of the one of those dividing lines where when all of a sudden motion capture, facial capture became much more common. But when I was playing Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, it was just like, wow, this looks horrific. They're like just puppets on a string making
I was waiting
grimaces.
for the adjective.
Well, it just, I don't know, it was upsetting, kind of,
Yeah.
Or it was very funny. Like, it really, it could go one way or the other, but you could feel like, wow, this feels so old, and yet it's less than 20 years old. Something happened at some point, and then games changed past that.
Yep.
No, I think there's definitely like multiple lines, I mean, definitely, I think, clearly the jump to HD is like a really important one that John mentioned. So that's kind of, and that cuts across, pretty much every genre and everything, because that's the certain genres or, types of game have these kind of different moments in time where a particular game comes along that, is very successful in it, that kind of reshapes expectations of players, or, sets the bar in a different place for developers and stuff. And that all can happen at, various different times. But the HD is something, that happened for kind of almost for everything at once. Although, of course, Nintendo kind of sat it out. So there is that. It's not even then. It's not quite that clean of a cut, if you like, at the kind of mid to late aughts. And even then, a lot of the things that would become, dominant in the HD generation, the seeds were there in the previous one. That kind of the email already kind of suggests, the things like the GTA 3 and onwards, and Resident Evil 4 giving birth to the third-person shooter. Like the kind of, I do feel like maybe the first half of the aughts, that console generation, with the GameCube, the PS2, the Xbox, like it's this kind of interstitial one between kind of the olden days of 2D games and, okay, we're just getting into 3D, but we're kind of really struggling with it, to the modern era of the late aughts onwards, where it's like, okay, we've kind of got our heads around 3D now, and the only thing we're kind of getting our heads around is high definition and so forth. So, controllers became a lot more standardized in that time, and all. So I kind of feel like that generation could be described as a sort of multi-year transition period. That you could definitely look at that. But Giob's right about the QTE figure stuff, like how dated that makes things feel. It just like it goes to show that things could. It's not just like a unidirectional thing. Things will come in vogue and go out and maybe come back again. You know what I mean? But something like the Bayonetta series, for instance, like you play the first game and it's got these QTEs like really front and center in it, and you will die if you fail them and stuff like this. And then it was quite a lot of years by the second one, and it's like they're still there, because I guess it's just like, well, this is something that people kind of expect, but they are dialed way back and just much, really rendered mostly unimportant. It's just like you get some extra halos or whatever, the in-game currency for doing them correctly. So you could see it right there. It's just, it's not just a one-way kind of travel.
I actually don't want to put a date on it, because I don't feel like there's an explicit like, this is a modern game versus this is a non-modern game. I think you can definitely point to I would say phases of modernity. I don't like to look at technology and go, that is modern technology versus, that is old.
Well, because it blurs, right? Because you've seen 8-bit games come back into a 3D era, and all of a sudden they're novel and new again.
But not even necessarily aesthetically. Like, to a certain, like, design sensibility, understanding of mechanics, refinement of how controlling should work. Like, these are all, like, if I was to ask you, John, what's the cutoff point for a modern airplane? Well, a modern passenger liner. I'll even what's the cutoff for modern Boeing mid-range passenger liner? So roughly between 500 and 2,500 mile range.
I mean, I don't know. I would say for that, I would say advent of the jet engine.
Yeah, but like that would be
something like that.
Yeah, like the 707. The 707 is an old as shit airplane.
Yeah,
I mean,
it always
really
depends what
grasping at
prism.
straws, right?
It's what prism you want to look at it through. You know, for a lot of like kind of products at this point, it might be when did they start becoming smart devices? You know, you might use that as the cutoff. You know, when did they become computers? Basically, when before they weren't. You could look at it through other kind of prisms as well. And obviously, email brings this up with respect to kind of certain tastes or certain kind of fads. They may or may not be fads, trends, let's say, where it's like, you get things that were considered kind of outdated, do come back into style, not just like an aesthetic, but sort of mechanics or concepts. Obviously, the kind of the whole kind of roguelite phenomenon, of like actually like at one point, that the idea of like, oh no, you don't get to keep your progress. Or something like that was just considered to be, well, that's just something that's outmoded. You know what I mean? Those games only exist.
That's just because you couldn't save it.
Yeah, that's exactly it too.
Those
I think
game designs only existed because you couldn't do something. So you just leave that behind in the past. And then what's happened is actually it's like, well, no, you can. This is a sort of valid design sort of type.
You can use that constriction to do creative things and to do things that maybe they weren't doing when it was a necessity because they just did it because they had to. But now I'm actively taking this back into myself because I have an idea of how to leverage it.
It's kind of funny how because the games that the Japanese players grew up playing are different from the ones that we ended up growing up playing here. Like maybe games like Dead Rising were misunderstood when they came out originally in in North America or in the Western world, and later on, I think people caught on like, no, wait, like that was a great game, and I now understand what the point was to not being able to do everything.
Well, even something like the Majora's Mask, you just kind of feel like it would have been slightly differently received today. That even though it's hardly like it perfectly fits the some sort of roguelike or anything else, but just the fact that it had these elements that were not permanent. Some things were permanent when you went back to when you played the Song of Time and went back to the Dawn of the First Day. The key thing being particular masks, but obviously a lot of things weren't, and it was a cycle and all that, and it just feel like obviously it reviewed well. It's not like it was some kind of derided game, but equally I think it didn't land.
It turned some people off.
It turned some people off, and I mean, it will still turn some people off. There's just people that are not. That's not their cup of tea. That's never going to stop being true. But there is, I would imagine, some territory, there where you've got people who, if you could contextualize it more, the way that you can now with these various sort of experiences that have these sorts of elements of like, well, some things kind of, can carry over, but not, a lot of things, they might have been more inclined to kind of, go with it and see, things that they did like in it.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, if like it was sometimes like the newer games going back with older gameplay. Yeah, the recontextualization that you mentioned, like I had that with Etrian Odyssey and dungeon crawlers. Like if you had told me I would enjoy a dungeon crawler these days, like back like 20 years ago, I would have said like dungeon crawlers? That sounds dumb. Dungeons? The worst part of a Final Fantasy game? Why would I want to, crawl through dungeons? But then a series like Etrian Odyssey, made it appealing and fun to me, and now I kind of see the point more.
It's similar, isn't it, in terms of like, oh, well, making your own map, like that's not, like that's just something you did because automapping didn't exist yet, right. But again, they showed...
Sounds like homework.
Yeah, they showed with that, just how you could take something, that may have been to a fair degree a necessity, and kind of make it obviously more convenient by having it built into a lower screen that's right there with the touch interface. But then show that actually no, this is something that you can find entertainment in, even in these days where you've got any number of RPGs and adventuring kind of that you can do, where it will map stuff for you, but this could still be fun on its own merits, and that's the point, is that things will go away, come back, and that means that it isn't just kind of, all right, everything's going in one direction, and then we can sort of identify a particular step change that happens here, and carve it up into eras. It's tricky to do that, but I guess the more, if you get sort of more granular with it, in terms of like particular genres, maybe it's easier. So like just sort of tracking the changes in things like one-on-one fighting games, or kind of RPGs or whatever. There it might be easier to kind of say, okay, well, this is when something happened and it changed everything, and from then on, like almost everything in the genre took its cues from that particular kind of game.
I think the other. To the other part of the question, where it talks about like this, that people are saying, oh, this feels like a game stuck in X year, that can be viewed as a positive in other forms of media. I'm going to give you an example where it's never a positive. Wow, this feels like a TV show from the 60s. You know what that means? It means it looks like it sucks. Because guess what? 60s TV sucked. And I can prove it because I've watched a lot of it. It's all bad. All of it. Every TV show produced from 1960 to 1969 is garbage.
I'm not confident I've seen any really 60s TV in any volume that isn't 60s Batman. So that is...
And it's a bad show.
That's basically my mantra. And I mean, even as a child, obviously, yes. I mean, I was about 5 years old when Burton Batman came out. And obviously that was massive, right? I mean, good God, they marketed that to hell and back, and people responded. It was huge. So, that was my model for Batman. That's what he was, all black, and, it was very moody, even if in fact it was, quite theatrical, but it seemed like serious to a 5-year-old.
Sure.
And then, because of that, there was a 60s Batman, got cranked up again on British TV.
Yeah, it's bad. It's a bad
show.
It's funny, but it's bad. And it's meant to be cheesy.
Like you really
but it's funny in ways they didn't intend.
You couldn't get Cesar Romero to shave off his mustache even. That's how low effort this whole thing is.
Oh, yeah. The whole thing is a joke. But I have a point. I'm going somewhere here. So give me some runway. You could say, this was like a 60s film, and that'd be loving. Why? Because, and this is true about video games, so give me a minute to get there. In the 60s, television as a sort of mass-produced concept of producing original content was only like 10 years old as an idea. The form was still very new, and they were still trying to figure out what to do with it. A lot of early TV is basically they put a camera on a vaudeville set and just said, do vaudeville. And the thing is, vaudeville was about an experience. You went somewhere, you had a social experience. It was big, it was colorful, which obviously TV wasn't. It was loud. It was glitzy and glamorous, and that none of that comes through on a really old, shitty TV that's just barely getting the picture on display, and it's warbly and garbage. It's a bad format fit, but it's all they knew how to do that worked. They weren't going to do long-form movies. That really wouldn't have worked, and the cost would have been completely prohibitive, and it would have been stupid. So by the 70s, when you start talking about wow, those are classic TV shows, people are now getting a handle on the format. They're understanding the strengths of the format. The technology has progressed enough, not just hey, this is a technology that we could use to make television that was produced for something else. And it's this is technology that's been refined for the last 15 to 20 years, specifically in the service of producing television. film had the same thing. If you go back about 20 to 30 years from the 60s, you're going to like 1930s films. There's some good ones. There's some very good films from the 30s. A lot of them are dog shit. They're so bad.
Yeah,
They're bafflingly
I guess
bad.
a lot of it just didn't survive for any of us to know what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I've seen some stuff where I'm watching it and I'm like, I can't believe, it's like, this was the most popular film of 1931. And I'm like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, and there's also changes there in the type or the, I wouldn't say the quality of acting, but the type of acting.
Right.
Like,
they changed from stage acting to being film specific.
The philosophy of like, what is screen acting at this point?
And like, you could even go back to stage acting, where like in the 1860s, people were still like pantomiming what they were trying to do. Like, I am in pain. I'm going to cover my face with my hand and really retch my body back so you know I'm in pain. It was like the 1860s where people were like, actually, you don't really have to do that. I can just kind of intimate that I'm in pain in a natural way and people will get it.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, with a medium like that, there's always, very similar to music, there's always somebody does something different and then that changes everything and everybody copies that.
And it's not like one person. It's the bleed of 100 or 1,000 creators working in this space and fucking it up and just making terrible nonsense garbage. And occasionally someone will stick their head out and produce something where you go like, that it's the meme where of just pointing at that one right there. It's like you get this moment of, that thing did something that nobody else has done up to now, and it's good, and it makes sense. They told a coherent story in a movie. My God, the geniuses. Mm-hmm. It's not just a horse moving quickly. And the thing is, like, film in the 60s, there's plenty of classic movies from the 60s. There's a ton of them, because the medium at that point was 30, 40 years old as a major commercial medium. And it was even older than that if you're willing to look at things that were more experimental. Television in the 60s was dog shit because it was a new medium. And the experience were stage, vaudeville, radio dramas, or movies. And those were the feeders into television. You had radio dramas get converted to TV shows, and they sucked because they're radio dramas.
I mean, you could even argue that television only really came of age with stuff like The Sopranos, where...
no, there's stuff in the 70s that's like, oh, this is meaningful and important.
Yeah, but I feel like television was always... I just think of... actors would always feel like, he's making a television show.
Oh yeah, it was still a stigma. There's still a lot of stigma about, like with Clooney. It's just like, when's Clooney going to break? He's a big star on TV. He's obviously a very good looking guy. He's very talented. Why isn't he a film star though? And then of course, he becomes like absolute Hollywood royalty eventually, but at first there was this hard divide. It's just like, it wasn't this notion of like, oh well, he's just a really big star that happens to have done it on TV. It's like, no, you're not really a big star if all you've done is successful TV and not had successful movies.
And a lot of that was also money. The money wasn't in TV yet, so that was part of it. But fundamentally, like, we start seeing the format of what good TV looks like in the 70s, and it continues to refine into the 90s. We hit that golden age where it's just like we're having these generational TV shows once a year, which means they're not generational anymore.
No. They would have been if they come along earlier. They might have been considered that level. But I guess it's just everybody kind of like you said, the TV matured and with it got more proficient in the 60s, but it also kind of, I guess there was just this sort of box about what kind of stories you could tell in it.
Exactly.
I mean,
and the thing, and that applies to any entertainment medium, and gaming is no different. And so that's why it's hard to say like, that's dated, because it's like, well, yes, like it doesn't fit in it fits in this very tight box, to use your word, that we look at now and go like, why are all your games jammed in this box of fighting monsters dressed as a knight? Well, because that was what we could do. That was what we did. And so when you say it looks dated, it would look dated if somebody made it now and at least didn't acknowledge that they were doing some kind of retro, like Maximo when it came out on the PS2, which is not a modern game, but I'm going to use it anyway as an example. Maximo is this like weird PS2 sequel to Ghosts and Goblin Ghouls and Ghosts, all that stuff. And it works in part, even though it's about a guy in night who gets his armor blown off to show his underwear fighting demons in a scrolling stage, because it fully embraced the fact that it is stepping back into the box, that it is a callback, it is a historical, or it is a modern antecedent to a historical series of games. And that makes it, I don't want to say makes it better or more approachable, but it contextualizes it in a way that any components that you might call dated are no longer dated. They're stylistic choice. And it defangs that, but they still feature all of the learning that's come along in the medium, all of the things we've learned. Oh, actually, that's bad. I'm going to give you an example. A Zelda game where you have to collect 155,000 Tears of Light every time you want to open a new dungeon. Someone inside Nintendo eventually raised their hand and said, hey guys, this fucking sucks. We should stop doing it. And they did. So like it's things like that where you learn basically through screwing it up. Like that's how you pick up these things. Like we made the same game over and over again, and eventually somebody's like, "Hey, I hate this component here. Can we just not do that? Can we do this instead? I've got a better idea for how to get the sense of speed, for an example, in a game. Like how to make it feel like it's going fast when you're in a car." How a fighting game should feel, how to handle online in a fighting game, like how to get rollback to work in fighting games. Like rollback was in other games before that, but fighting games were just hard to get rollback to work in because, you know, how perfect things have to be. And the idea of like literally rolling back the state in a fighting game feels weird. How a strategy game should play out. Go look at like, was Command & Conquer the first one of those RTS games? There was like 4 that came out. Bang, 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 bang. I think Command & Conquer was the first one to drop in that set. But you had Command & Conquer, Total Annihilation, Warcraft.
Red Alert is more contemporary with Total Annihilation.
Yeah, I'm just trying to like trace out like sort of the progress line that they go through. And you start seeing...
before Command & Conquer, there was Dune 2.
There was, and there's like a weird demarcation line where like, oh, they've got these things coming in, and somewhere in there you can say, that's where modernity started. But I don't know where you draw that line. You draw it before StarCraft, I think.
Oh yeah,
but I'm not sure. Like
Warcraft 2 was, yeah.
Potentially. I'm just not. It's like I'm not sure which one is the one where I would say, buddy, you're not quite modern, because there's some.
Like I would say for first-person shooters, I would say Modern Warfare is probably the demarcation line.
Modern Warfare changed things, definitely.
Yeah. The systems that it layered upon the typical first-person shooter formula.
What's the first person
and its popularity? Really.
What's the first-person shooter where we decided that actually no online was the important thing? Was it Quake 3 Arena?
Yeah.
Because like you could make an argument that maybe that's it.
I mean,
Unreal Tournament.
There might be I don't know about Quake 3. I mean, like that's a one in that series that went like, no, we're just online actually. But there might have been like Tribes or Tribes 2 or something before that. I'm not sure of the timeline.
Something in there where they're like, actually, no, the future of first-person shooters is online, not hallway shooting. It's open spaces with a lot of people in them shooting at each other, not like crawling around shooting at cyber demons. And they were right. Like whoever landed on that was right.
But sometimes you just get these twists and turns that can't really be sort of taken as things that are, kind of these hard lines of demarcation for an age of design. Because like when you think about it, like Halo was meant to be this huge, kind of moment in the history of first-person shooters, and it was, right, in many respects. Mm-hmm. But that's a game about, Huge levels, right? That's what we could do with the Xbox
Big
and the
fucking levels.
the hard drive and all that that's built into it. We could do these massive open levels. Forget corridor shooting. That's over. Corridor shooting is over. And then, like, it's less than 10 years to Modern Warfare that John's on about, right? And
yeah,
isn't that just like basically a cinematic corridor?
Yeah. But that's the inspiration though. It's the set pieces, less
but
than
more the online play I'm thinking of as well.
Yeah,
sure. That's true. But I'm thinking about it in a campaign sense. It goes to show that again, it's not unidirectional. Like these things, they do kind of come back around to what is presented to us in marketing, and even to some extent what is felt at the time. Of like, oh no. This is just better. This is just more advanced. You discover later, it's more of a taste thing. It's more of a, you're like, yes, it's been done better than you've seen it done before, and you see what's good about it. But, some people just will always prefer the more, kind of crafted, narrow kind of experience for a campaign mode. So, that's what people think of as being something that might be considered a benchmark for modernity. It turns out it isn't, just a few years later.
A lot of times if those things come back into style, though, it's because they've been recontextualized. The concepts of that format have been re-examined or reviewed. Like, we're getting a lot of corridor shooters coming out now, like games that are Doom inspired.
Sure.
But their idea is that, like, hey, Doom was a really fast game. What if we made it faster? What if we made it so fast? What if we made it crazy fast? Or we made it ultra gore, or we said we're going to start you with a sledgehammer. Like, just gimmicks and stuff to make it different, make it more interesting, to put a new spin on it.
Well, it's like Fortnite. Fortnite isn't doing anything out of the box outside of the fact that you can build boxes.
Good job.
Pretty proud of myself there.
No, that was good. I could see where you were going. I'm like, oh, I hope he sticks this landing, because if he doesn't, I'm gonna roast him. And even that's not. I mean, crafting wasn't new. Crafting was already huge. There were already a million things that took the ball and ran.
Yeah, and
I
mean,
crafting topic,
dropping in from a flying bus that was basically already being done in PUBG.
Yeah, I mean, they basically took concepts that were already working elsewhere, or they put out their builder shooter and it didn't do well, and then they basically looked at PUBG that was doing very well at that point, put that in there, and then they did well. And now you can play as Becky Lynch shooting Iron Man after dropping out of an airplane, because that's where that game is at this point. It's the quest to demarcate modernity, I think, is probably a fool's errand. But I do understand why you can look at a game from 2008 and say, like, God, that game feels like it's from 2008, and that be a pejorative. And it totally makes sense, because you can think about how much we've learned in design in, 2008, that's 15 years ago now.
Oh, and also you just kind of feel like, as well, like there's just sometimes things are done in a particularly popular or acclaimed game, and they have their reasons for doing it. It might be that it does actually work in that particular game, or maybe it doesn't, but it just happens to be in an otherwise excellent game.
Right.
So then it starts filtering into these other games in which either, it just doesn't fit, but, there's probably some executive somewhere saying, that game sold really well the way they did it.
My kids love the Fortnite.
I think you might want to consider, getting where the action is and implementing it into this particular game. So that's where, you get these waves of things being implemented into and it may oftentimes be, not to great effect. And then, once we get X number of years away from that trigger event that caused that, they will sort of stick out, because it's like, there's nothing else in this game that kind of supports it, that suggests it should be here, and it just sticks. And so the only way you kind of then account for it in your mind is like, oh yeah, it came out in 2008. So that's why, that's why it is the way it is. That's the only way you can explain the way it is. There are some cases where you can get a kind of positive version of that. I think there are some cases where, you've had some games come out, like, maybe certain kinds of RPGs or something, and people will say, like, oh, this reminds me of like a 32-bit RPG, and it might be like a backhanded compliment in a way, because it might be like, yeah, the production values aren't that great, or maybe it's a bit janky, but on the other hand, it's also affectionate. Because it's like there was a certain kind of reckless abandon about RPGs in that era, in the sort of gold rush after Final Fantasy VII's amazing success, this sort of game changing
like James,
success.
what would you say about Radiant Historia?
It feels like a Super Nintendo RPG told in mechanics that would not have been possible.
And that's probably a good thing, right?
Yeah, like it feels like a DS game in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Which it is. But also it feels like they were trying to tell a Super Nintendo story, but with the maturity of writing that video games didn't have at that point, because video game writing wasn't very good.
Well, and also that for the English-speaking audience was very difficult to achieve because of the cartridge constraints on just how much text you could put in there and how good was the localization going to be, etc., etc.
And what was expected of a story was not...
Radiant Historia
that wasn't there either. People thought that video games were this thing.
Radiant Historia already goes beyond what you'd expect now. But you're right.
But Japanese RPGs are a weird thing, though, because like they probably like some of the references or some of the jokes or whatever were probably written out of them in the localization/translation, but also like we wouldn't understand as many of those references as we do now because. Now anime is huge over here. Back then it was not, and so only recently, going back to the first Final Fantasy, did I realize like this has a lot of D&D shit in it. Also a lot of Miyazaki shit. Like this is a Castle in the Sky reference. What is it doing there? It's always been there. It's just that I would not have noticed because I didn't know what Castle in the Sky was. I didn't know Miyazaki, so
let me give you an example to Greg's point, though, of like, you could say this was like a 32-bit game and it be somewhat backhanded, but also affectionate. If I tell you this film reminds me of a 60s Italian film, I'm not telling you it's a good movie. I'm telling you it's a bad movie. I'm telling you right now, this will be one of the worst movies you've ever seen. Because the Italians fucking were miserable at this shit. But I'm also telling you it's going to be the cheesiest thing you've ever seen. That there's going to be wild and inappropriate shots of women in various stages of undress. And that there'll be like weird non-blood violence where you're like, well, that seems like somebody is working out a fetish. Thanks for that. That makes those movies really fun to watch. Like, not in a good, I'm having an artistic experience, but more in the, I'm getting to understand the psychology of this director in ways that he's probably wishes I didn't.
It would generally be taken as a style thing, is the point. Because Italian films were very much more about the style than a plot that made sense, or it's just,
or even a concept that made sense.
No, a lot of the time, they're just less concerned with that, and more like if you watch like a Mario Bava film, and it's like, well, does it hold together as like a thriller compared to something Hitchcock would have made, which clearly they'd seen Hitchcock to say the least. But it's but just look at the crazy lighting, look at the cinematography. Like, it's more interesting to look at than your sort of better constructed thrillers, that would have been made in the US at the time. So it's just like, you'd be making a stylistic comment rather than necessarily like, a comment about, whether you like that style or not, I guess is then for the person in question to decide. But it would be like, do you... point is that whether it's affectionate or not is kind of beside the point. It's like, no, this is the style of thing that you're dealing with, and that you certainly can get that with video games because, as we said, you've had things come and go, in and out of style. In various genres, and so I think it's kind of you will get similar things.
Sorry, Greg. I think you ruined. Like, I think that James, like by talking about Italian movies from the 70s was actually trying
60s.
to bring it back to 60s, bring it back to video games because of the upcoming, the newly announced Bud Spencer and Terrence Hill Slaps and Beans 2, which is coming out very soon.
Yeah, it's like a video game from the 90s where you want everyone involved in it to die.
Right.
I would say that to Greg's other point, though, like after Breath of the Wild came out, I remember us saying on the show, boy, there's going to be a lot of Breath of the Wild clones. And there really weren't that many, because I think that the scale of what they were trying to do was so much that people might have started and gone like, you know what, this is actually really hard. But there definitely have been games that have come out since then that took some, we'll say, experience ideas. The Ubisoft game that bombed was probably the tightest one. But then there was, wasn't it? Didn't come out that long ago. It was an eShop game that basically has all of the.
Well, it's Ubisoft. It's forgettable. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Well, Immortals Phoenix Rising, which is just the biggest mismatch.
No, but there was an eShop game that came out a few months ago that isn't trying to do the open world, but it has all the climbing and navigation mechanics of even including the stamina wheel, and I'm blanking on what it's called. But like it's so clear, like they even copied how the stamina wheel looks down to the color palette.
Well, I mean, you got Genshin Impact too.
Genshin stylistically has done some stuff, definitely.
Yep.
So what we expected we'd be able to start calling things like the Breath of the Wild clone era, and it didn't happen.
It's too big.
Yeah, it's almost too grand to clone, which is funny. Nobody dares put a motorcycle in their game that breaks their game because they're cowards.
Well, it's like going back to the email. It's like, do you think there's going to be a Starfield clone? I don't think so. There's really not a Skyrim clone.
Well, to be fair, with these enormous games, isn't it? It is a problem because there just are so few development houses, especially with the consolidation in the industry, that are even capable of putting out, something on that scale, especially with any kind of frequency. That, to have a sort of the gold rush that I described after FF7. In the 90s with RPGs, like you can't really get that again, because again, that was still, yes, developers were grappling with the greater complexity of making games where, you might have polygonal graphics alongside 2D elements and you've got more storage space and stuff, but still, the teams were so much smaller, the budgets were so much smaller that it was much more possible for a bunch of different companies to say, hey, let's go for it. The entire Famicom industry is just a bunch of, companies that weren't even games companies just saying, screw it, we could try that. Let's put a few developers together and see what we could come up with. Those days of that kind of, unbridled, like, kind of enterprise are gone. That's definitely something that
BASF isn't making video games anymore.
That is something, and obviously what came with that was like a lot of bad stuff, stuff that wasn't thought through, stuff that wasn't, particularly deep and all that. But it also, did have this sort of spark about it that, all these different sort of companies trying their hands at different experiences, gave the chance for some of them to hit, and do something that no one else was doing, and obviously it's much less like that now. So that I feel like is perhaps one way which we could sort of think of an earlier age. Again, I think basically before, especially kind of before the mid to late aughts, but even perhaps just before the 21st century at all. That was that younger period of games where it just felt like, it was more like the Wild West and a bunch of people could just kind of come in and see what they could do with the medium versus the obviously very vibrant, indie scene, notwithstanding the much higher barriers to entry and just crushing scale of everything that's happened, in particular, to go back to what John started with the ramp up of the HD era that really kind of started that, I feel.
So the game I was thinking of was called Smooshy Come Home. It's even got a leaf that you use like the parachute. But the to your point about like in that early era, it was company. I mean, Nintendo was that way. They weren't a video game company. It was a side project they spun up because, like, I don't know, maybe there's business to be had here. I mean, it's the origin
they've done
of
some amusements, haven't they? You know, like the whole thing of like doing Wild Gunman in disused bowling alleys, because the Japanese market had a sort of love affair with bowling alleys that abruptly came to an end. So a bunch of them were just like there to put
so that happened that happened in the U.S. too. In the 70s, bowling got huge for some reason, and then it fell off. And so there were all these closed bowling alleys that got turned into weird shit. But the J&J Dream Factory. The full name of J&J Dream Factory is a division of ChemHealth Pharmaceuticals Better Living Through Chemicals. Is a joke about the fact that when we were researching the first J&J Dream Factory segment way back on the telethon probably 10 years ago, we kept finding these games that were published by like, oh yeah, this game was published by Colgate. It's like the toothpaste company? Yeah. It's like, why? Did they make it? No, they imported it from Japan and then rebranded it. And that became the segment of just like, what dumbass shit can we pull that never got brought in from Japan? And then what flat license would we slap on it to Americanize it? And all the deal was that we had basically been given like $100,000 from ChemHealth Pharmaceuticals because they were getting bad rep for all of the people dying from their products and wanted to try out this new video game business. Like, it was a narrative based in reality. Like, I made the joke, BASF isn't making games anymore, but there's very much a period where BASF was publishing video games. You might know them for making digital tape. And digital tape.
Yeah.
But also digital tape, because that's what they do. It's insane, but that happened. And
it's like hey, what's the last game released by Victor Musical Industries?
Yeah, anyone? Exactly. Actually, they release mobile games now.
Oh, there you go. That does not surprise me.
Well, of course, like, the whole like I remember quite a while ago when I realised that Coleco was for Connecticut Leather Company. You know, that's what made the Coleco, a leather company from Connecticut made this, fairly, it wasn't a market dominating console or anything, but it was significant, it was a non-trivial player in the industry at this time, just like that. So it wasn't just isolated to Japan by any means.
The other thing, though, you talked about how like Final Fantasy VII came out and there was this like, we need to make. The thing is, Square Enix was doing that to themselves. They were like, we need to make bigger games every time. What happened in the US was a lot of these games that were PlayStation JRPGs that weren't coming out here were suddenly getting localized.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, we got to localize this game because of the rush. And you look at it and you're like...
It's always made a feel of like a bigger explosion than there was, because it's like, well, no, there were always a lot of RPGs made in Japan.
We just didn't get them.
Yeah, there were a lot that weren't localized, but especially not just with the huge success of Final Fantasy VII, but the fact that it was on PlayStation where, the margins were more favorable than they had been, on Super Nintendo. I think made it just more possible to, and a greater storage capacity that went along with the cheaper cost to produce. It just made these localization decisions, especially, in the light of these big sales numbers that FF7 had put up, these decisions could seem economic now. Whether they ended up being successful or not is a separate thing, but you could justify it now if you were somebody in a North American office making a decision on do these numbers add up or not.
I want to say like NDK, not that NDK, made video games, and they make like ultrasonic transducers. Like, it's just like, yeah, we'll make video games. Fuck it. We can make microchips. We can put them in an NES. We're good to go. We got this on lock. Bandai was a toy company, and they started making Did they make good video games? Never.
Tomy was the same, right? Tomy was making video games.
Tomy still makes toys. Just trust Tomy to think of it.
Yeah.
That's just the way all this shit rolls. It was a weird era, and we still see this experimentation though in the indie space. I think actually the growth of the super indie has probably done more for giving us the opportunity to see new ideas, and also like there are eras of that where you can see ideas start to get re-replicated over and over again. The Metroidvania resurgence, where it's like, Jesus God, how many of these things y'all gonna make?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on that. I didn't know how to bring it up, but like there who was allowed to make games, or whose games we were allowed to hear about, has changed so much, like in the PlayStation 2 era and GameCube, like you still had the kind of the mid-sized developer, and then like the kind of like
the mid-sized publisher was the big
publisher part. Also, and yeah, like more and more consolidation, bigger and bigger studios. Now the AAA space, more and more crowded by these companies just gobbling up developers and putting them putting them to work in the Call of Duty mines or whatever it is.
I would say ActiBliz is not the. I mean, they're the example now for a different reason. I mean, we all know who the real example here is right now.
The Embracing.
Yeah, the Embracing, which has now turned into the Bankrupting.
Sounds like the sort of really shit Highlander sequel we never got.
Yeah. Unlike the good Highlander sequels.
No, it's a very high bar, I'll have you know.
So some games will feel old just because they feel like they've been made by a team that's, of a certain size that we don't really see anymore. But like back then, you had games made by, this game was made by just this one dude. Have you heard of Cave Story? And so it was a big deal, and now how many games have been made by one dude? Like there's so many.
Oh, yeah. It's not novel the same way.
Right. And, back then that was a Dujin game. Like that was a free game. Like it was,
he just put it online.
The guy was not even trying to sell it. And now, like people, it used to be that you couldn't sell your game on Steam unless you did this and that. Like unless you couldn't sell your game on the WiiWare service if you didn't have an office space. Stuff like that. And now like it's so much more open.
They were reviewing based only on Don Koopman videos, eShop Wii U games, Nintendo World Report stream earlier today, and like once Nintendo opened the gate on like anybody can make a Wii U game now. Boy, anybody made a Wii U game at that point.
Yeah, so there might have been more, bad games that made it through.
Oh no, there were definitely more bad games.
Yeah, no, so I understand that, but I feel like there's also been the other effect of there was less of a risk, like we mentioned very quickly. I think it was Greg who mentioned kind of this is just the way it's done. Like this is how we're making games now, and I feel like the dropping the requirements. Yes, there were worse games that came out, but also there was maybe more of a loosening of like, well, this is how it's supposed to be done, and so like there was a more experimentation, more playing with different game genres, and just like you mentioned, Metroidvanias, right? Metroidvanias seemed refreshing when they were, when we only had the Shantae games and we're like, oh shit, like they're making a game like Metroid. Like I remember Metroid, that was fun, and they don't make games like that anymore. And so I love Shantae. And then, you go back to Shantae now and you're like, well, this is maybe not the best designed game, and also it's not doing much, that was not done by Metroid before it. Right?
And then you get to the point where you're like, I would like you to stop making Metroidvanias now, please.
Yes, but also you've also got like people clamoring for Hollow Knight, the sequel.
Well, they're fucking weirdos.
Shantae, one thing I discovered from playing the Monster World 4 remake on Switch, Shantae is that game. Like, good lord, they just ripped it off. Like, I don't think they would be coy about it either. Like, it's very direct, like how it starts and the character, and like it's like they just lifted a lot from that game, and its predecessors presumably as well. I think apparently that game that Limited Run are bringing back, the Shantae Advance. Like the ROMs or whatever, like the things that had previously been kind of out there on the internet that had kind of survived of that development project, like had Monster World 4 assets in it. That's
Oh, God.
That's how much like it's the model
That's dark.
for Shantae. So they while they were putting because obviously it was not in a very advanced state of development, they just had essentially like temp assets just from that game in Shantae Advance, which I'm quite sure will not be there when that game does see the light of day.
I hope they are
in limited run games release of it. But no, Metroid style games have gone on a very strange journey because they kind of got revitalized once in the GBA generation, and then a second time in the era of digital distribution. And now it's like there are so very many, but really, it's it's in two phases. So again, it's a little bit hard to just say pre-modern and modern, even with that, because the kind of the Game Boy Castlevania games in particular. Following on from Symphony of the Night. I mean, we sure as shit wouldn't call them Metroidvanias without those games.
No, but we had it was 2 directs ago now with the farming games. We basically at the end of it were like, stop fucking showing farming games, because they showed like 6 of them, because we had we've had Harvest Moon forever, and then the Harvest Moon license got weird. So then we had 2, and then we had, I can't remember what the name of that indie game was.
Stardew Valley.
Stardew Valley.
Yeah.
And then the floodgates opened, and then it was just like everybody's making farming games. You're going to have so many goddamn farming games. They're going to be everywhere. And it all traces back to what we called in the West Harvest Moon. The first one, way back on the Super Nintendo. Like, there's this weird lineage that comes out. And with the rise of independent games, but also one thing I touched on this when I was talking about how television evolved, where like they were no longer using tools designed for other mediums adapted. The tooling and technology continued to improve, making it more and more feasible to produce content. You could do nonlinear editing. Nonlinear editing was huge for opening up the doors to who can make content, because before you had to literally edit the film. Well, gaming is having that same thing. We have more tools that are more easily accessible and usable by people who don't have to be really deep-minded programmers having to build their own engines and try to model physics and stuff. And as the tooling becomes more available and the tutorials become more approachable and the things start to become developed, the tools start to become developed for a more hobbyist audience. This is where the Unity conversation would go if we already weren't long. The barrier to entry drops. So now you can have a single person making a game, just like you could have single auteurs making movies. Once the technology got good enough that they didn't have to go back to their dorm room and try to cut the film with the lights off so it didn't get overexposed. Like they gained the ability to produce things and took a lot of the overhead out, took a lot of the like specialized skills out of it so they could focus on delivering their vision. And so we're in that phase now with games. We're in that phase where you can bring in somebody who doesn't even make video games, and they can learn enough to work with maybe 1 or 2 other people who have made games and deliver their idea despite lacking what would previously be a prerequisite to even get in the door at a company, let alone to lead your own project. And you can have things like, Joe, what was that music game that you talked about? The DJ who passed away recently?
Oh, it was that's Avicii, Invector, Avicii Invector.
Yeah, like that. It wasn't because he had any kind of video game experience. There was an idea that worked with what he knew, and there were a couple. There was a small group able to deliver that idea using tools that just didn't exist 10 years ago. And they ended up producing something neat and unique. And that happens a lot now in that space. And that's why it feels like these indie games are diversifying more from where they were, I'd say 10 years ago, where it felt like a lot of them were like, hey, we're going back to the Super Nintendo era. We're going to produce games like you remember from your childhood. And now it's like, hey, I've got this idea. It's fucking weird. Let's do it. And it does also mean, like we talked about on the eShop, there is so much garbage. In fact, there's a stream coming once I get all my OBS stuff fixed called The Garbage Man, where I'm just going to go through and look at this stuff because I did the stream once before where I ended up stuck with some real trash.
Are you gonna do the Simpsons song?
I might. And I ended up with that weird game about cutting hair where I just had to remember the lies I told her every single time. It was so stupid. Because it's just stuff and things, but you still get like weird, neat ideas. And that also filters up weirdly back to publishers. Publishers are now willing to fund these things. And we're almost getting the return to not even the AA, like the single A game of like, hey, we found this person who's got a neat idea. We're going to fund the game and publish it. And so it's an arc you can trace through pretty much any creative medium, and especially ones that have a technology basis, because as the technology starts to improve, but also starts to be targeted towards more and more, or is it less and less technology-minded individuals and less specified professions. It just becomes more generalist and able to pick up a lot of the slack. You get people able to deliver their vision. You get more pure representations of the vision. And you start to see a refinement where things that in previous, we were talking about fucking Chargeman Ken the other day in the Discord. You don't see animation where they keep having hair show up on the fucking film because somebody didn't check the film before they took the photo of the next animation cell. Like, there's just a certain amount of professionalism gets baked into the process, and so you don't have to provide it anymore. It just comes in. It's free. You get it for free, and that makes it easier to work on your vision and to deliver refinement and to refine the ideas, the things that actually matter about a film or a TV show or even like a play. But most specifically, a video game where it's much more interactive. You're feeling what's happening. And so if that's bad, it's going to be bad. And so, like, you can get by on vibes with a 60s Italian film because that's all they had. Honestly, that's all they had. If you get through, like, vibes and bottles of wine, that's it. That's what they ran on. Like, a video game, you can't get by on that for more than a couple hours because at some point it's going to suck the play and you're going to be miserable. So as we've gained the technology and tools that conquer a lot of the, like, you can screw this up and make the entire process terrible to start with and just settle that for you. And as we come up with basic standards that are like, hey, do this and you'll be fine. Like, you don't have to figure out how jumping should work. We've got hundreds and hundreds of games that have solved jumping. Just do what they do. Then it really comes down to, like, delivering the vision, and the floor for how bad a product can be goes up. And the ceiling commensurately goes up with it. Maybe not as much, but you don't see, just like, if you go back and look at some of the stuff that was coming out on, like, the home computers in the early 80s, there's an infamous game called Squidge that came out in the UK that you can't clear the first room. It's impossible. It literally cannot be done. The only way to do it is to change the code of the game. And it got published because the bar for professionalism was so goddamn low that nobody caught at any point in the pipeline you can't clear the first room and did anything about it. So, like, we're getting to a place now where, and that was also like Wild West creatives doing their own thing. We're getting to a point now where all that's refined. And so it's hard sometimes to look back at games that didn't have the benefit of all this tooling that we have now and go like, that game is modern. Because they make decisions or they implement things or they do stuff where we look at them and go like, why the fuck would you do that? And the answer is because they didn't know any better. But it's hard to put that in your brain. It's hard to say, like, they just didn't know. I know, and you know, and we all know that that's stupid. But they didn't know that.
Well, or again, as you've alluded, there's some practical reason to do with the tools they had at their disposal that kind of led you down that path. That, you know, if you were just looking at it in some sort of abstract design sense, you wouldn't make those decisions. But, you know, you kind of, you end up going down that road, and then, you know, it makes sense to you as you're, you know, making those decisions because you've got to deal with the practical reality of assembling these things with the tools that you have at your disposal. which of course none of us have when we're playing it. So, we can look at some of those, what might be, in context, like kind of sensible decisions and say, why does it work like that? I don't get it. Presumably there is less of that disconnect now because, like you said, there's less of those sort of practical difficulties, the sort of arcane kind of and specialized knowledge that being put between design, conception and execution.
But we've also been doing this long enough that you might run into a situation where you're like, well, the best way for me to get around it is to do this. But there's enough history where a creator can stop, put themselves in how that's going to feel from the perspective of the player and go like, oh, no, that's actually going to suck. Don't do that. Like, I understand for me that makes it easier, but that's going to be garbage. Let's go back and try something different. Let's find a different solution. Whereas in the past, they might not have been able to sort of intuitively say like, oh, yeah, that's actually going to be miserable. Don't do that. And so, yeah, like to a certain degree, I think games are getting to the spot now where we are producing games that will be playable 10, 20, 30 years into the future. And I could say that because how old is GTA 4 now?
GTA 4?
Five, presumably.
Five,
GTA 5
yeah.
came out in 2013.
It was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and they're still releasing it.
I think it's almost exactly 10 years.
They had an anniversary recently, which is why it popped into my head. And that's like because that game effectively delivered the vision of what a GTA game, at least the single player portion, was going to be. And it's just it
delivered the ability to endlessly monetize it as well, which is another sort of might be another one of those sorts of lines of demarcation that if you're looking at it at least from a certain point of view, that people may break up the games industry's eras. Whether it's, pre-modern and modern or perhaps, more than just a binary sort of breakdown. But, that is certainly one way of doing it, isn't it? The sort of the eras of, games being dominated by the arcade and how it monetized play. Mm-hmm. And even though there were, of course, home consoles and portables and whatnot, their game design was still heavily informed by arcades.
Because it's what they knew.
And then, the monetization era afterwards, when arcades ceased to be as relevant and, getting then the monetization era of smartphones coming in, and microtransactions and all that, you could split it up into those kind of three eras, and how, what it meant. Not just, how did companies make money from the games, obviously, but that's, a matter of a fact.
That's an important question, though.
It is an important question, but it's how it influences the design and the actual experiences, how it changes the way people make the games, and certainly, with oftentimes, how companies are going to, want their games to be made and say, this needs to be, because that's the thing we've talked about, certain features that you might think, we need to chase that trend. We need to put a multiplayer mode in. We need to put, QTEs in, whatever it might be, to keep up with the latest thing. But monetization methods. Well, I think there's a great deal more zeal about that that comes from the corporate level.
Daddy's got to get paid, Greg. I feel like we could do this. We could do this for an entire episode and just sit there and break down examples.
Well, it's a pretty monumental question because it is basically like, well, you need to examine game history pretty much in its totality in order to assess, is there a line one can draw somewhere that cuts all the way across all of it to split it up into modern and pre-modern?
It's also philosophical. Like, how do you define modernity? How do you Like there's so many ways to cut and slice this particular topic that we could each get an entire episode to lay out our thesis and not arrive at any kind of consensus. Be in completely different places at the end and just have a big dumb argument. But I think there is, generally speaking, if somebody says, this feels like a game from, I definitely feel like I've heard people recently say like, this feels like a PlayStation game, and mean that with affection. And so, I think I think definitely said this feels like if somebody says this feels like an Ubisoft game. That's not affectionate. I'll tell you right now.
There's
no affection there. But a lot of that's just burnout. They're burned out on an idea that feels like it's been played to death, and so sometimes you just got to read it that way. They're not saying like, boy, the games from 2008 were fucking dog shit. They're saying I'm burned out on the concepts that were popular at this particular time, and this game feels like it basks in them. So. I don't have a great conclusion for this segment. I don't know. What do y'all think?
No, I mean, I think that is a lot of it. In fact, is that the longer view, oftentimes, like I already mentioned this, will kind of prove out differently. In terms of things that we may look at as being dated, as perhaps something we could consign to an earlier era. Because we're tired of them, because they're just played out for now. We then later see that actually, well, it wasn't all bad. You know what I mean? It just got overdone, and we repetitive. And, the people that were doing it, it wasn't coming from a creative place. It was just because it's like the market chasing its own tail. And,
right.
If it has a period to lie fallow, it could come back. And, you've got people that played games like that when they were young and then they're old and they're interested in revisiting that type of experience with refinements and advancements that come from more experience of the medium advancing in general. And all of a sudden, we can't say that it's a thing entirely of the past anymore. And it's a thing of the present again. So that's the fact of the matter is that as much as we might like to try and divide things up into something of the past and something that's modern, even if it's not super recent, the fact is you are at your own peril because there is a cyclical component at play that may well render your pre-modern thing very relevant anytime soon.
Yeah, I think when you say something is dated, I think really what you're saying is there's an overabundance of stuff that has been deemed superfluous in the time that's passed since, because there's always like that core sort of, in this case, gameplay that endures, but the games that feel dated is stuff where it's like it's stuff that's gone in and been discarded,
right? Or been enhanced to the point where it's no longer recognizable.
Yeah. So modern's it's a tricky term. It's a very hard term to define. It's something that's always moving. It's a moving target, really.
Yeah, I know it when I see it.
Yeah, I tried to draw a line between dated games and modern games, and only Devil's Third is on the modern side. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, we all live in a post Devil's Third world.
It's ahead of its time. It's ahead of its time. It's still waiting for its time to come, but surely
it's going to happen one day.
One day, people see the genius. Yeah.
But weirdly, only the multiplayer mode. The rest of the game will never see its day. The part where you threw melons into jet engines for some reason that I don't entirely understand. All right. Well, you know what? We actually wanted to do other emails today. We did, but we've gone 2 hours. Oops. In one segment. So I think it's time to end the show. What do y'all think?
Probably, yeah.
You're editing.
Yeah, it's true. Well, then we're ending the goddamn show. All right. So on that note, next week we're going to do some new business. We're probably still going to do some EO because we do want to talk about. I know we got emails about both the emails that came out of the Microsoft lawsuit and about the Unity stuff. We actually teased talking about the Unity stuff last week. But again, as we joked last week, it'll change by the time we finish the episode. It didn't. It changed about 9 hours after we finished the episode and changed again since then. So right now, that's still a moving target. They've promised, quote, in a few days, 4 days ago, an update. So, we'll see how that all goes. Things are going great in the Unity land, but we'll talk about that. I think those are two topics that have some interesting parallels, but they also have some differences. And I think that they both need time on their own to give people the right context and the right sort of like business understanding of how we got where we got on those, but also to explore the parallels and why they've ended up sort of tied together in people's heads beyond CEO's bad. So we can dive into that, and I want to give that the appropriate amount of time, and we don't have that kind of time tonight, unfortunately. So we'll get to that. I think there's some interesting thoughts there, and beyond just like burn all the businessmen, which is definitely some of the tenor that's come out of this, which has been wild. There's like larger, broader conversations around the financial interests and how they materially produce revenue and how companies look at margin. And Microsoft has their own fucking metric for margin that no one else uses. It's dumb. The whole thing is dumb.
I was so sure you were going to say there's a broader conversation to be had about what accelerant to use to burn the business.
Well, no, because most accelerants leave behind obviously detectable revenue or residue. You wanna find one that doesn't, and the answer is jet fuel. It's obvious. So, get it. But if you really want to do, electrical fires are really the better approach. They are much less traceable back to you. So keep that in mind. But emails, they go to rfn at nintendoworldreport.com, and we might spend an hour we are averaging one email an hour. That is dire. So you could send them. Maybe send us ones that are a little bit tighter focus so we can't spend an hour on them. That'd be cool. I want you right now listening at home thinking, God, they spent 2 hours on 2 emails. How the fuck did they do that? I want you to think of an email that's 5 or less sentences that asks a very narrow, but it can be extremely specific or like very niche or wild or out there question. Just think of one. Just think of something that's like interesting to you. You might think this is a question for an audience of 1, and if it really is, we just won't use it. That's okay. But if it's something that we think's interesting, we'll bring it in. So get that email in. Put it down on paper. Write it to us.
I wouldn't put it on the writers, though. I mean, like, we have shown again and again that we will disregard what the actual question is.
We didn't this time. These were just very broad topics.
That's true,
could
but Guillaume is also accurate. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we did not have to take them to the places that we took them.
No, but I think I disagree.
Did.
I disagree for the second email. I really think to talk about what modernity is, you have to define what it means. And
I think the solution is just not talk about what modernity is.
That's literally the premise of the email, John. John's answer to this email took too long is don't answer the email.
I probably agree with Guillaume. We could have reined ourselves a bit, but
we got to work on ourselves here.
But we didn't.
Yeah,
but look, the listeners have a role to play in this too. They do. You could say it's all us.
It's ultimately their fault. They asked the question, so
yeah, exactly. Ask a question, get an answer. So, write us a question, and think about something that might be really specific, something that's interesting to you that you might think, this might not have a huge number of people who are interested in it, but ask it anyway. Put it in an email. Emails go to rfn at nintendoworldreport.com. That's rfn at nintendoworldreport.com. And with that, I'm going to wrap back around. We talked about it last week. There was a radio trivia episode with anybody?
Misa.
Who remembers who's on? One person here's not allowed to answer.
No.
Who remembers who's?
I didn't. Jar did.
What?
Right.
Oh, okay.
What's going on right now?
I didn't hear the answer, so...
Jar Jar was the guest, apparently. I haven't listened to it yet, but Greg, I think that you were.
Yeah, so it's just nobody answered, so I just said Misa. Just trying to as if Jar Jar just snuck in. And that
was where I was going to go with. That was why I said someone here's not allowed to answer.
Yeah, so that's what I was using. I was using a persona.
Radio Trivia Gungan Edition is going to be the episode title here.
If anyone's wondering why Jar Jar's remerged, I think we referenced this last week, but there was the Unity email that we've got references it, so that it's not. Yeah. It may well seem like it's apropos of nothing, but actually, it's there's a reason.
So normally on the second one we give a game away, right?
We have done in the past, certainly. Yeah.
Would you like to do that, or would you like to let them wait? Let them hear it themselves.
I think I'm quite comfortable giving away the fact that at one point we do discuss Chrono Cross, because that was my pick. It was a very simple calculus. It's like, this is absolute stone cold classic soundtrack that has been ineligible essentially for radio trivia for its many years, even before it was a podcast. unlike, its predecessor, Chrono Trigger, because it had never been on Nintendo systems until the Radical Dreamers edition that came out recently, and I think it has been on sale, with Square's like TGS sale and stuff.
Yep.
So, yep, seemed like a good time to say, yep, this belongs on Radio Trivia, so we did that.
It absolutely does. That soundtrack, like the main theme, gets all the credit for that game because it is absolutely a killer. But that soundtrack front to back is unbelievable. So, yeah, it's worth listening to. Give it a listen if you haven't. And that game's worth playing. So I can't speak to the quality of that port, but that game itself is worth playing. So give it a shot. It's weird as shit. So Greg, what is our end music this week?
Well, did you want to go with the dot hack stuff?
Sure, I'll do that.
Obviously, maybe you would speak about the game one more time, but obviously we haven't because it's been all email. But.
Yeah, so I can.
But my
I can do it
original pick for the record, as an alternative, I don't know whether this makes any difference or not, would have been from Baton Kaitos Origins because of the those games came out.
What were we going with?
I was going to go with the guitar version of the Valedictory Elegy.
We've done the... Okay.
Because it's Sakuraba. Why wouldn't you use the guitar version? But
because he used all the guitars, all of them.
I just because I'm mostly familiar with the remix he did himself for the Smash Brothers. And then, but with the re-release of the games, the collection, they've put the soundtracks up on streaming services. So I was looking through them, and it's like, oh, there's a guitar version. Oh, well, obviously we're going to use that. But it could wait for another week, or if you want to do Dot Hack now.
Let's go with it because so the collection came out. It's available now. It's not dubbed for. If you ever get the chance, go read the exact text of why they decided to not dub it because it doesn't make any goddamn sense. It's amazing. So go enjoy that. It's funny because the dub for the first game is all-time bad, and I'm going to miss it for that. And somehow the dub for the second game is all-time good. It's such a good dub. And I'm going to guess it has something to do with the fact there's only 3 characters instead of 9 of them. And I'm going to really miss that one because that dub is actually really remarkable and people are pissy in fun ways. So it sucks, but, here it is. It's out now. This is the origin of Nintendo's relation with Monolith Soft. And so this brings us to, of course, their huge contribution to other projects that Nintendo's had working on them, producing a technology that fundamentally makes a lot of their big achievements go, contributing technology into the Nintendo ecosystem, and obviously producing some all-time classics for Nintendo systems like Disaster Day of Crisis.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that's... Speaking of great music, also introduces a tremendous amount of good music, but not really with Sakuraba, unfortunately.
No, it's true, yeah. And obviously, especially with the guitar version, this is very, vintage Sakuraba. So it's what you expect from the man. And this is the battle music from Baton Kaitos Origins. We've used, Guillaume has made a couple of picks from the first game over the years, but I believe this is the first time we've used anything from Origins. And as I say, it was included in Smash Brothers, a remix by Sakuraba himself for the Xenoblade stage to kind of recognize that overlap that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, on that, it is time for us to go. Bye, everybody.
Later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.